Welcome to the Red Dice Diaries. This podcast is a rambling journey through the wonderful world of RPGs from the viewpoint of a long-time GM and player. The music at the start of this podcast was Nightmare by Alexander Nakarada and is used under Creative Commons license. Welcome back to the podcast, and in this episode I'm going to be talking about a recent OSR-based gaming experiment that I've just concluded, and about what I feel worked and what didn't work with it. But before I go into that, I've received a voicemail message from Larry Hamilton at Follow Me and Die.
Hi John, this is Larry Hamilton with Follow Me and Die. I just wanted to call in and say I agree with Matt Jackson's appraisal of your last review and his idea to drive around the real locations and compare. That sounds pretty cool. It'd be a challenge for game masters to do a similar thing with their own hometown or where they live now. On your last episode about designing your character to fit your style of play, that's a good tip. That's a good game master tip that game masters should keep in mind for their players, that if they've got a player that doesn't like a certain aspect of the game, that's a good idea. I'll have to keep that one in mind. Keep up the good work. Enjoyed your podcast.
Thanks for those kind words, Larry. Yeah, I love the whole idea of driving around the UK and sort of looking at some of these locations and seeing how they could be adapted for use in OSR, whether Middlelands or otherwise games. It's a bit challenging for me because for medical reasons I can't actually drive, but myself and my wife Hannah have been talking about going away to like some different towns and whatever in the UK on holiday. So I'm hoping that when I do, I can sort of have a look at those places, maybe a few of like the smaller villages and that aren't covered in the Midlands, and maybe look at expanding them. I know that Glyn, who wrote the Midlands, is on about doing his Midazine, so I'm hoping to submit some stuff to that, and maybe a few of these smaller village write-ups can be part of that. So keep an eye out for that, and I'm going to try and get on with the writing of that. Thanks for the kind word about the podcast, Larry. Catch you soon. Okay, so the main point of this episode is to talk about my gaming experiment, which was my Undying Lands game, which I've recently wrapped up and concluded. Now, the idea of this, partly inspired by a few other games I'd seen, was to have it be a sort of open-ended hex scroll style game where I would schedule a game once a month and the group of players could arrange ad hoc games themselves by booking a time slot with me. And the idea was that it was an undiscovered continent that had just opened up via a land bridge, and the player characters were the first groups of adventurers going out and exploring it. It was going to be run using, well, the one session we did get to do was run using White Box, Swords and Wizardry White Box, and that went pretty well. The player characters were exploring a sort of Celtic style tomb. They fought some undead, a couple of people died, the rest made it back to civilization. Happy days. And that all seemed to work really well. I put a fair amount of work into it beforehand, creating some extra like racial classes, half-orc, tiefling, stuff like that, and making sure I'd got all the relevant material available in documents and creating a Facebook group so that everyone could look at the stuff. The unfortunate thing was that as we went on, it was very difficult for the players who actually tried to organise the ad hoc games to get other players involved and also find a time that meshed with my own schedule. Now, I think partly that was down to me maybe not publicising and pushing the game enough, since there seemed to be a bit of a sort of lackadaisical attitude about it. But I think also part of it stems from the fact that, for right or wrong, I'm one of those GMs who really does enjoy doing the prep and the work that goes into making a setting. And I found it quite difficult to keep up the enthusiasm for a setting where we were only going to be playing like every couple of months. We had a few sessions cancelled because of people dropping out at the last minute or time schedules not syncing up. And it was very difficult to keep the enthusiasm going with that sort of slow drifting schedule and without really much prep work to do, since it was a sort of open-ended sandbox game. So in terms of what I think worked well, I think it was an interesting idea. I'm glad I tried the experiment, but I just think that those sort of open-ended games maybe don't really work as well for me as a GM. I'd happily play in one that someone else was running because I always get very enthusiastic about games. I'm happy to post things in Facebook group. I'm happy to create characters, fiction, all that good stuff. But for me as a GM, sort of having a game just sort of like drift along and a session taking place maybe once in a blue moon didn't really appeal to me as much as I thought it would in practice. So I decided to wrap it up. No ill feeling towards any of the players. That's just the way it goes sometimes. And like I say, it was an experiment. But I think personally for me, I'd rather use that freed up time to run a more regular campaign game or a more traditional campaign game with a group of players who are going to be able to commit to a reasonably regular schedule. So that's it for this episode. If you have any questions or suggestions for things you'd like to see in the podcast in future, please either email them to reddicediaries@gmail.com or drop me a voicemail at Anchor. Until I see you next time, wherever you're playing, take care and enjoy yourselves.